I wanted to say a few words today, not to cast any aspersions, but to express some very significant concerns. There is some partial paralysis hanging over our legislative session right now. And it is because the specter of Washington, D.C. is hovering over all of our major decisions. And in two very important areas. The first is healthcare policy, and the second is transportation. There are 403,142 Hoosiers who are covered by the HIP 2.0 program. I want to remind everyone this is a program created by Vice President Pence. It was supported by the legislative Democrats. I was very privileged to get to meet with our federal regulators in order to support the program and to urge its adoption. The people of Indiana may soon come to learn that HIP 2.0 is the Affordable Care Act. It has a different name, it has a different branding, but that is its underpinning. The initiatives in Congress right now are causing a lot of consternation here in this building, because I know that the governor and I know that the enactors of HIP 2.0 want to see this coverage preserved. And I also believe that they believe the federal government made a commitment to them to help sustain this program. Within the next day, many members of the House of Representatives from my caucus will be sending a letter to our federal delegation, which includes our 9 U.S. representatives and our 2 U.S. senators, urging that whatever they decide in the U.S. Congress about the future of health care, that they make it possible for us to preserve this program. It is too important, and the power is currently in their hands. The other thing that has to be acknowledged here in the coming weeks is, if Washington fails, what we are going to do to preserve the major elements of the HIP 2.0 program. You will note that the state budget had a $1 cigarette tax increase in it. I have suspected that revenue placeholder is there as a backstop for some of the transportation initiatives. That option, to the extent it exists, is going to probably be taken off the table based on what happens with health care. Which leads me into the second point about transportation, our need to reinvest in Indiana's roads and bridges. It already appears that there are significant differences between the House and Senate leadership about how we're going to make these new reinvestments. We have long debated the House Republican plan here on this side. It seems that Senator Kenley and others may take a meat hatchet to that bill, and we're far from making a prediction about what that final work product is going to entail and what's going to consider. But we have to ask ourselves what's going to happen in Washington, D.C. as well. President Trump has talked about $1 trillion infrastructure investment in the nation. But given some of the political capital that's being expended on other things out in our nation's capital, it doesn't appear that that is going to be enacted this year. Maybe a miracle happens and it transpires, but that's making it very difficult for the legislative leaders to plan about the shape of our infrastructure bill. The final thing I want to add, while we've got these problems with Washington, we do have a few things around here that we could be doing better. I'm still hopeful that we can seek some fundamental reforms in our political process before the end of legislative session. The bipartisan commitments to things like non-partisan redistricting seem to have taken on water. That water needs to be expelled, and those initiatives need to be renewed. More than ever, I'm walking around Indiana and I'm finding that some of those fundamental reform issues are heightening themselves in the public consciousness to the extent that they may become ballot box issues in the future. One thing we learned from the last election is that people don't like the current system that we have. They were looking for solutions and they were reaching out for change. That's one of the changes that we can deliver here in Indiana, and we've seen it happen already in other states. So I want to make a few remarks about the work that we still have ahead of us, but it's evident that we are going to have require more than ever communication with our federal lawmakers and influence them to take the heat off of Indiana, because we have many major things that we could do, but in a number of ways they're making it more difficult through the ongoing uncertainty. And with that, I'll be happy to take any questions to the extent that there are any. And Abdul's not here, so somebody's going to have to go first.
So the healthcare bill, represent IBC. The healthcare bill is not going to be resolved, it seems, before Easter at the earliest, just about the time you guys are leaving. So what does this legislature do to be prepared for all eventualities there?
Well, there's one very obvious thing. If they had any illusions about using that new planned cigarette tax revenue to backfill shortfalls in their desires for transportation spending, they're probably going to have to back off of that. I don't see much alternative, and I think there's going to have to be some public commitment made that if the cigarette tax is going to be increased in any way, there has to be a firm allocation of those dollars to healthcare needs. There's just too much uncertainty in Washington, and now it looks like they may have to make a fresh run at an entirely new bill that for